to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that we're on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashwa, Wea, Miami, Mascouten, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these Native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. So with that, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Fall 2021 Friday Forum and Conversation Cafe series, Unpacking Racism, What Are We Carrying? And my name is Zoe Foote. I'm the director of the Immigration Legal Services and Assistance Program here at the Y. That is part of the New American Welcome Center program as well here at the Y. And not only is this the first Friday Forum of the semester, it's also a Welcoming Week event. Welcoming Week is a global event put on by one of our national partners, Welcoming America. And during this annual series of celebrations, communities bring together immigrants and US-born residents in a spirit of unity to build strong connections across the community and affirm the benefits of welcoming everyone. In Champaign County, Welcoming Week is led by the University YMCA's New American Welcome Center. And this year, over 20 organizations have hosted a fantastic, fun, and informative combination of in-person and virtual events. Welcoming Week ends this Sunday on the 19th, but we have a packed weekend with several great events coming up, including a virtual citizenship info session and trivia game this afternoon starting at 4:30. It's also National Citizenship Day, so a great way to celebrate that. We also have a presentation about DACA updates with the DACA Renewal Clinic tomorrow out at Parkland. The 8th Annual Welcome Awards will be hosted virtually Saturday afternoon at 3:30. And then there is an in-person outdoors Hispanic Heritage Month celebration Sunday afternoon at the Urbana Middle School. And there's a few other things going on as well. So I encourage you to follow us on social media to learn more about Welcoming Week. And for those of you who are here in person, you can grab some flyers and information on your way out. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Zoe. I'm going to move a couple of things around as we are screen sharing, just so we can get a great view of our panelists. So my name is Cynthia Markstoller, and I am here to share for anyone who is attending their first Friday Forum or Conversation Cafe today. Conversation Cafe is hosted by Diversity and Social Justice Education, and it's been running since 2014 as part of the Office of Inclusion and Intercultural Relations Lunch on Us series. This series has hosted speakers and workshops that reflect the range of important and emerging issues on anti-racism, diversity, and social justice, both campus and beyond. Previous topics have included anti-racism education, the intersection of food and social justice, Black girlhood, ableism, privilege, and many others. A little bit about Friday Forum background. It's a weekly lecture series held each semester that strives to raise awareness about national and international trends and events, and provides a space to address topics of relevance and urgency in our society. Some of our past series have looked at using art as activism, environmental justice, and last semester we looked at the current state of our democracy. This semester, the University Y is so excited to be partnering with Diversity and Social Justice Education for the entire fall 2021 semester-long series. This semester, Friday Forum and Conversation Cafe sessions will be accessible in person at the University YMCA or virtually through Zoom, Facebook Live, and streamed by Urbana Public Television on YouTube. Zoe gave a little bit of an introduction on our series theme this semester. As we're hearing about and experiencing continual accounts of local, national, and global racism, it weighs heavy on our communities. And please join the University YMCA and Diversity Ed in addressing the legacies of racism. Engage in dialogue with activists, academics, and artists as they share their perspectives on the intersections of racism and reimagine solutions moving forward. I would like to take this time to have a generous moment of gratitude for our sponsors this semester: Women in Gender and Global Perspectives Program, Humanities Research Institute, LGBT Resource Center, Women's Resource Center, Education Justice Project, Department of Urban and Regional Planning, Office of the Provost, the Center for Global Studies, First Mennonite Church of Champaign-Urbana, Center for Advanced Studies, Latina and Latino Studies, Illini Hillel, and so many more. Today, I'm happy to hand the baton over to an incredible moderator and panel that will dive into the intersections of racism and migration. We will have a 30-minute panel and then have a few minutes for question and answer time. If you're online, please submit your questions in the chat. And if you're in person, please jot down your question on the provided paper that's on your seat. I believe it's the orange paper. Once you've completed your question, I'll be moving around the room periodically to collect those questions, and then we will get them sent to our moderator to ask the panelists. We also want to bring your attention to a QR code that is on your seat that takes you to a brief evaluation that will allow you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your impression of this lecture and series. Thank you for your participation with that in advance. Now I'm going to transition to introducing our fabulous moderator for the panel today. Daniela is a senior at the University of Illinois studying psychology with a minor in global studies. She has been working with the New American Welcome Center at the University Y since 2019 as an immigration case assistant. In addition, she currently serves as the executive vice president for the student organization ICAUSE, the Illinois Coalition Assisting Undocumented Students Education. Outside of the legal field, Daniela is pursuing an honors thesis in psychology under the guidance of Dr. Thomas Quapill. When she is not preparing immigration cases and working with clients, Daniela loves to read fiction and nerd out about all things Marvel. She hopes to pursue a career as an immigration lawyer and later a law professor. Daniela.
Hello, everyone that I am seeing virtually, as well as everyone in the room. Thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity to be here with you all. Let me get a sip of water before I continue. All right. So thank you, panelists, for taking time out of your day to come here and to speak on your own experiences, as well as your professional opinions on a lot of these topics. We appreciate you taking the time. So I will go ahead and introduce our panelists one by one. To begin, I'll introduce Dr. Susan A. Agwal, PhD, a native of Uganda, resettled with her family in Champaign many years ago. With a concentration in global studies education, Dr. Agwal earned her doctorate in education policy and organizational leadership from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Her research interests center the intersection of higher education and immigration, international education, and policy. Professionally, Dr. Agwal brings to the table 15 plus years of experience in social services, teaching, training, and collaboration of published research. In addition, a champion of community programming with a strong social justice ethic, she's a co-founder of the CU Black and African Arts Festival and serves as a local international transition navigator and mentor. Currently an Illini Science Policy Scholar at the Office of the Illinois Lieutenant Governor, Juliana Stratton, Dr. Agwal lent her talent to the policy development and external outreach team. Here she continues her passion for community-centered public service to address a number of issues, including agriculture equity, education, and food insecurity. Thank you, Dr. Agwal, for joining us today. Next, I'd like to introduce Lauren Aronson. Professor Lauren Aronson is an associate clinical professor at the University of Illinois College of Law, where she founded and has been teaching an immigration law clinic since fall 2019. Lauren previously served as an associate professor of professional practice at Louisiana State University, where she taught and directed the immigration law clinic for 4 years. Prior to that, she spent 2 years at Michigan State University as a clinical teaching fellow. And before that, she was a staff attorney at the National Immigration Justice Center in Chicago, where she worked primarily with detained unaccompanied immigrant children. Lauren got her start in immigration law and exposure to clinical teaching, serving as a refugee and immigrant advocate at the Harvard Immigration and Refugee Clinic in Cambridge. After a brief brush with insanity, working at Dewey and Amp, LeBoeuf LLP in New York City as a tax attorney. In an alternate universe, she was a professional poker player and dealer. Lauren graduated from the University of Virginia School of Law in 2008 and from Rice University in 2003. She is fluent in Spanish and illiterate in technology. Since its inception in fall 2019, the ILC has represented over 80 individuals from 25 different countries, over 1/3 of whom are or were minors. The ILC assisted these clients in matters that span the entire immigration journey, from no status to full citizenship. Their work focuses on humanitarian-based forms of immigration relief, including claims for asylum, special immigrant juvenile status, deferred action for childhood arrivals, non-immigrant visas for victims of crimes, and temporary protected status. Thank you, Professor Aronson, for all you continue to do in the community and for being here today.
Thanks so much.
Next, I'd like to introduce Judge James R. Fujimoto. Judge James R. Fujimoto is a graduate of the University of Chicago and DePaul College of Law. He was a partner in the immigration and civil rights law firm of Alexander, Fenerty, and Fujimoto before being appointed to the Chicago Immigration Court in 1990. While an immigration judge, he was an officer with the National Association of Immigration Judges and frequently spoke at local, national, and regional conferences hosted by the American Immigration Lawyers Association, the Federal Bar Association, and other professional organizations. Since leaving the bench in May 2019, he has served as an adjunct professor and senior practitioner in residence with the Asylum and Immigration Law Clinic at DePaul. In the latter capacity, he provides substantive law and skills training to attorneys, Department of Justice accredited representatives, and legal staff of immigrants serving nonprofits with whom AILC partners. Thank you, Judge Fujimoto. And lastly, I'd like to introduce Professor Michael Leroy. Professor Michael Leroy has published extensively on antitrust in professional sports, immigration, and employment policy, in particular the gig economy. Strikes and lockouts, voluntary and mandatory arbitration, employee involvement teams, and labor law implications stemming from national emergencies. Professor Leroy has testified before the full U.S. Senate Committee on Labor and Human Resources, consulted at the request of the President's Council of Economic Advisors in connection with the Taft-Hartley labor dispute involving Pacific Maritime Association and International Longshore and Warehouse Union, and served as an advisor to the President's Commission on the U.S. Postal Service. This bipartisan commission adopted Professor Leroy's recommendations to Congress for the use of final offer interest arbitration in place of conventional arbitration in contract impasses with various postal worker unions. I'd like to add that Professor Leroy also teaches an amazing seminar course, and I really recommend everyone take it. All right. So thank you all. We're going to go ahead and get started with the questions. So I just did a brief and pretty, oh, this sounds like it's off. Hello? Oh, you guys can hear me? Okay. So I just did a brief and pretty professional introduction for all of you, but I'd like to give you all the time to introduce yourselves personally, as well as respond to this following question. Within your own academic professional career, where have you witnessed the intersection of racism and migration? And I'll go ahead and start us off with Judge Fujimoto.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. My exposure in the field is going back 40 years, before probably just about all of you were born. So going back to, I'll give you two maybe examples in response to the question. First, and most recently, of course, we've all, I guess maybe the best word is survived the Trump administration. The first thing he did upon taking office, and you all probably remember this, it was commonly referred to as the Muslim ban. Now, That, of course, ended up being enjoined, and then they came out with the Muslim ban 2.0, and that was enjoined, and then they tinkered with it further, and eventually the Supreme Court agreed that the proposed ban, quote unquote, that they proffered was acceptable. I mean, it started really before he was elected. This was one of his campaign themes, and obviously it was very racist and xenophobic. But that's how he conducted his campaign. He doesn't really know the law. Well, no, he doesn't really know. He doesn't know the law at all. But if you study immigration law, there actually is a section in the Immigration Act that authorizes the president to do things of that nature, not in such a blatant blanket form. But if you don't mind, I had this in my notes. I'm just going to read it. It's called Section 241F of the Act, and it says that whenever the president finds that the entry of any aliens or any class of aliens into the U.S. would be detrimental to the interests of the United States, he may, by proclamation and for such period as he shall deem necessary, suspend the entry of all aliens or any class of aliens as immigrants or non-immigrants, or impose on the entry of aliens any restrictions he may deem appropriate. So if you look at that language, that's actually quite sweeping in nature. And it almost suggests the president can do whatever he or she wants. Now, it's not that simple, and it's not that blatant or broad a power. But one thing, when you study immigration law and you study court cases, that you'll run into is what's called the plenary power doctrine. And by that, in simple terms, the courts have pretty much held that Congress can make the laws governing immigration almost the way it wants as a matter of sovereignty. Or to put it in blunt terms, this is our country, so we can make the rules for who gets in or who has to leave. Now, of course, even something like that, it has to comport with some measure of due process, and that's where certainly the Trump administration went way over the line. But when you study immigration law, that is one thing that I think is a little bit troubling, and also can explain why many things that happen in immigration law don't seem fair, seem to single out groups for disparate treatment. But sometimes they get away with it. What happened in this Muslim ban case, and it ended up going to the Supreme Court in the case called Trump versus Hawaii, you probably heard of that. Basically, the way they were able to persuade the Supreme Court and get this partial ban through is to say that we want to ban people from certain countries where their procedures at their airports, security procedures aren't up to snuff. And basically, that's how they were able to persuade the Supreme Court to enact what it proposed. I mean, if it were Trump, if you saw the way Trump campaigned, he wanted to ban all Muslims. I mean, if you remember the famous quote, well, what about Norway? What about people from Norway? Well, that would have been his ideal demographic. Only people that get in are people from Norway. But this whole concept of plenary power is rather troubling, and it's a recurrent theme if you study the cases in immigration court. So that's what I've seen on the bench and actually working. I don't want to take up too much time. You asked for examples. When I was still in private practice, immigration is affected by lots of things over the years, right? You go back early enough and basically you're talking about eugenics, right? But there are other factors that have weighed in over the years. One of them actually is economic competition too. And I think back when I was in private practice, if anybody's heard of Vincent Chin, who was a Chinese American in Detroit, who was actually beaten to death by some folks who just looked at him, assumed he was Japanese. These were auto workers, right? And there was economic competition, and Japanese automobiles were doing very well, and Detroit wasn't. And he was actually victimized, and he was actually beaten and killed just because he looked foreign. And unfortunately, you see that from time to time, hopefully less now. Anyway, those are two examples. I don't want to take too much time on that.
Thank you so much for your input. As we move on, Professor Leroy, how would you respond to this question?
Well, first of all, I'd like to go back to the introduction where we acknowledge that we're on the lands of Native peoples, and we're probably not going to discuss it today. But I don't think talk about immigration should proceed without acknowledging that we have a very troubled history as a country in granting citizenship to Native Americans. It doesn't seem to fall within the rubric today. But for those who don't know that there is this troubled history, our Native Americans were not granted citizenship until legislation by Congress in 1924. I'll be brief. Our speakers have the benefit of much more practical experience than I do. I have an academic perspective, and so do they. So they're far better prepared to answer the personal aspect question. But I can relate this in two quick stories. One, I saw a need to develop a course for law schools that deal with the employment element of immigration. If you look at an immigration casebook, they're typically like phone directory thickness, but they deal primarily with constitutional issues and refugee and asylum issues and things of that nature. And then sporadically they deal with employment. And because of the nature of my work, I wanted to look at employment. So I tried to focus on that. I wrote a case book. It was not published. But in the course of doing this, and while my mother was terminally ill, I had the book complete. It was under review. And it was at that time, and I was about 50 years old at the time, she told me the following, that my father's a Holocaust survivor. He's Jewish. He came to America. The story I told was contradicted to a degree by the story she told me now that she was terminally ill, that my father had passed away. She didn't even realize that he came to this country illegally. He did falsify his papers. That in itself is an offense that would lead to removal. He couldn't tell his own wife, my mother, this until very late in his life. He couldn't tell his family this. Like many unlawful immigrants or lawful immigrants, he was extremely successful. Here's the point I want to make with respect to Daniela's question. I grew up in an affluent home. I am white. I'm a suburban kid, but contextualized, my faith was racialized. It was not only racialized by Hitler, it was racialized by our immigration code. And if you're sitting in the audience and you happen to be Polish or Italian or Greek, Asian, Indian, Korean, and so forth, I'm telling you that our legal system until 1965 was explicitly racialized. And so even if you consider yourself assimilated and white, the law didn't treat your ancestors that way. And I'm the picture of assimilation, and yet I didn't fit the definition of white. That's one story. The other story I would tell you briefly is I wrote a thought experiment paper that was published in Georgetown Law Journal online. Here's a thought experiment I did. I looked at the 16 southern states and some Midwestern states that have criminalized abortion again. And I opposed that legislation, but I flipped my thinking and said, what would happen if we considered the possibility that a fetus is an unborn child per the terms of these restrictive statutes, that the heartbeat laws say that an unborn child has legal personhood. And then I asked the question, what are the implications for deporting the mother? And so I said, in these 16 states, pregnant women who have an unborn child with a detectable heartbeat cannot be deported because, in my view, they are carrying somebody who has been granted legal personhood. And I stretched the concept of birthright citizenship to the unborn child. Well, it's a thought experiment. Within 2 weeks of its publication, I received an amazing email and then followed up with a phone call from an immigration attorney in the Atlanta area. He works with Catholic Services, the immigration function of Catholic Services. And the long story short is he was representing a 42-year-old woman who had come to the United States unlawfully 20 or 25 years before, had had a family in the United States, had a job at the same restaurant for 15 years. Her tail light was out on her car. She was arrested. She was pulled over. She was then referred to ICE, and then she was subject to deportation. Then she learned she was pregnant. And so the attorney contacted me and asked if I would brief the case in behalf of the unborn child. And back to Judge Fujimoto's opening comments, politics matter. He thought the case would be interesting because of Bill Barr, the Attorney General, who has jurisdiction over this. And basically, he and I, although we had never met, were sort of saying, if y'all are serious about this legal personhood in an unborn child, then you need to rethink how you're deporting pregnant women who don't have legal status. So those are the two personal encounters. I will just quickly add, Marguerite gave birth. Her deportation was put on hold, but it was for pandemic reasons, not anything I did. But whatever it took, Arturo has been born in the United States, and he is a birthright citizen. And for that, I'm grateful. I see I will share a link in the, I see Elsa's comment. I'll be happy to do that, but I yield the time back, and I'm sorry for my chatty talk, except to say Daniela is one of my former students, and I'm inexpressibly proud of her accomplishments.
Thank you so much, Professor Leroy. And yes, it's an amazing read. I'm very happy that you will share the link so everyone has access to that. We're going to move on now to Dr. Ogwal, if you can share your response to this.
Sure, I'll be as brief as possible as well. Thank you so much for everyone for coming on, those who are online and both also there at the Y. We're just really grateful for this opportunity to have this conversation. And I just want to continue on with what Professor Leroy and Judge James had talked about, in that we really have a strong history here of rejecting people who either don't look like you or don't speak like you or don't come from the same ethnic group. America, unfortunately, has that history. And so as we pointed out earlier, in that it really wasn't until 1965 that you see a lot of I would say mass actionable movements towards change happening, because we all know that there's always been some kind of ground roots activity happening, right? So what I want to note here is that particularly for me, because I come from a social, well, three layers. So I am from Uganda, even though our country is a British colonized, or was a British colonized country, and I speak British. We come from a British English speaking nation. That didn't stop me from having personal experiences with racism or discrimination, and neither did it stop my family from doing that. And I pause to say that because oftentimes we find that people will say, "Oh, you have to speak English. You have to speak English," as a mode of trying to be accepted into American society. But again, and we can talk about it some more later throughout our discussion, but there are still so many points and places in which we can continue to make improvements concerning those cultural narratives of who belongs here. And then from my social services teaching career, particularly for me, one of the most pivotal experiences has been I was doing a workshop trying to really help some of our local African immigrants really try to navigate their way. And this was a room full of doctors and really trying to find their way in practicing medicine again, especially those who have been practicing in their home countries for 11, 12 plus years, fully professional. They have the knowledge, the training, the skills, all of this. And time again, they were asking questions as how come we have to start over here, particularly within our policies and with our laws, particularly our policies education-wise for skilled physicians or skilled folks. And so one of the most pointed things that they said to me was, Susan, we all bleed red. When I cut you open, you're not going to bleed blue. You're not going to bleed white. You're not going to bleed any other color but red. So if I can see that as a surgeon, or I can treat you for a common cold, whether I'm from Africa or whether I'm from America, why can't I continue to practice and help expand medicine to all the people that need it? And, to be honest with you, I couldn't even really fathom an answer for him at that moment. All I could do was empathize with him and tell him that we're going to be working behind the scenes to really help some of these policies take a second look at what's happening here. And then the other experiences that I've seen is often, again, working with immigrants who are coming here and even international students who change their status to immigrants here. That when they, again, are trying to find work, the biggest thing is that they're either not taken seriously, whether it's a phone interview. A lot of folks don't like to do those. Then we're also finding, I'm also finding that oftentimes healthcare right now is a big issue, being taken seriously by doctors. When a woman is going in to go and complain or about a particular issue, an ailment, or even needs just basic maternal help, again, she's not taken seriously. And it gets to the point where now it's about paperwork. You didn't fill this out, so we can't treat you here. Or even if someone takes them seriously, they have to repeat the story over and over and over and charge exorbitant amounts to be able to get the care that they need. And so I don't want to continue on. I have stories for days, but those are just a few examples that I've witnessed just lightly over my course of work.
Thank you, Dr. Agwal, for your invaluable experience and bringing that to the table today. And we will finish off this question with Professor Aronson.
Thanks, Danielle, and thanks to everyone for attending and my co-panelists. So I'll give a little perspective just from an immigration advocate, from an attorney who represents immigrants. And I'm going to try to be quick because I know we have a lot of really important questions to get to. So 2 examples in my practice of racism. One, simply representing a woman from a Middle Eastern country with an anklet. So when you're released from detention, often you're given an anklet so that ICE can monitor your whereabouts. Mm-hmm. And I was advocating for this anklet to be removed. They're painful, they're annoying, and they're just unnecessary, frankly, for most people who receive them. And I was at the ICE office in New Orleans advocating for this woman's anklet to be removed. And the ICE officer, when he saw my client, he saw she was wearing a hijab, and all of the rest of the individuals in the office were from Latin America, from Spanish-speaking countries. He said to me, "Oh, your client will be fine. Don't worry. I'll get her anklet removed. She's not one of the ones we're worried about." So that was, a very blatant example of racism against the Spanish-speaking people of color, and for my, although different client, right, wearing a hijab and clearly an observant Muslim, was white. And I guess to this particular ICE officer, less of a threat in his opinion. So that's one example. And then another example, in many cases that I work with, one of the primary things that we have to supply either to USCIS, which is the agency that adjudicates a lot of immigration benefits, or to the Department of State, or to the DOJ with the Immigration Court, is documentary evidence of identity. And this seems like a simple thing. Well, of course, you have your birth certificate or your passport or your driver's license, but it's not simple. And there are lots of countries where it's either impossible or extremely difficult to acquire documentation. And generally speaking, those are the less developed countries and the countries where the residents are mostly people of color. And so to me, requiring this documentation, and although there are ways to get around it, it's onerous often. It requires affidavits. And I know from personal experience, even when you submit the affidavits that they request, you may be rejected in your application. So this is just another example of where race comes into play, and people of different races are disparately impacted by things that seem on their face to be non-racial and innocuous, but really aren't. And again, just like everyone, lots to say, but I'll wait and see what I can say later.
Thank you so much, Professor Aronson. So our next question is going to kind of combine a few of the ones the panelists have. So some of you have touched on some historical immigration laws or practices that have racist undertones or blatant racism embedded in them. Can you speak a little more on how historically this racism within the immigration system continues to be seen today and how it may impact the future of immigration? And if you feel as though you've already answered this question, that is fine, you can pass to another panelist, but I'll leave it open to see which panelist feels comfortable answering.
If I can step forward, just because I'll be the briefest, okay? Don't overlook the fact that our Constitution has an immigration provision that affects a lot of the conversations about who becomes president in the United States. We do not permit naturalized citizens to hold the office of United States president. At last count, now I'm looking at the 2010 census, so it's out of date, we have roughly 20 million naturalized US citizens. That is connected to the birther lie that was so corrosive and so delegitimizing about Donald Trump's attack on the Obama presidency. It's not going away. There's no conversation about it. And that's why I want to tease it out and bring it forward. We're probably going to focus on something called the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 and or executive orders. Those are crucially important. But underneath it all, our Constitution embeds this idea that only a person born in the United States can be president. And I don't see how in the foreseeable future we're going to get past the politics of delegitimizing people who have dark skin. Kamala Harris is a prime example. Born in the United States, went to school in Urbana, Illinois. If she runs for president, she's going to suffer from the same birtherism attacks.
Thank you.
I'll follow up on a couple of points that Professor Leroy has made, a couple of really, really great points. One, with regards to the question of naturalization, you know, when you look at the Constitution, it doesn't actually discuss immigration much at all. There's a reference to, and really the first immigration legislation was in 1790. It's called the Naturalization Act, and it basically said if you want to be a naturalized citizen in the United States, considered a citizen in the United States. Essentially, it was open to quote unquote free white persons, free white males, frankly, not even free white females. It was free white males. And there were a succession of acts that followed after that. The one probably that most people are familiar with were the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was in the late 1800s, and that was really the first and only piece of legislation that specifically singled out a particular ethnic group or banned or barred a specific ethnic group from entering the country. And that was actually upheld by the Supreme Court, again, under this plenary power doctrine that I mentioned before. It's our country, and we can decide who gets in or who has to stay. The other point that I wanted to follow up on from Professor Leroy was 1965. He's absolutely right, because until 1965, the way that they would determine who gets admitted into the United States was based on what's called the national origins system. And by that is meant you would take the number of or admission in the future was based on how many people from your particular country were here in the past. So in other words, if we assume that the great majority of original settlers in the United States were, and of course, other than slavery, the majority of settlers in the United States were from Northern Europe, then going forward, they would say you're entitled to the same amount of Northern Europeans that were in the United States as of the 1890 census. It was a way then of essentially perpetuating the same ethnic and racial composition that you had in the past. And as Professor Leroy pointed out, it was until 1965, that's the way they determined who gets in. And it was only in 1965 that they opened it up further. Still, with this whole plenary power doctrine, and I think the question that you had raised, Zoe, was currently, certainly you've seen examples of racism in all throughout, of course, the Trump administration and the types of proposals, proposed regulations that they tried to pass through. Migrant protection protocol, remain in Mexico. Has anybody heard of those? It was a big change from the past. Essentially, if people were coming here, particularly from the Triangle or from the South, seeking asylum, they were generally allowed to come into the United States physically to present their claims. But what Trump did in what was called the Migrant Protection Program or protocols was essentially say, hold it, you've got to go wait in Mexico. We'll call you when you can come in and present your application for asylum. And as the history points out, these folks were congregated around the border in very dangerous conditions, great hardships. It was a terrible program, kind of related to that, maybe even before that, was the whole separation of children. And I won't go into all that other than we all know it happened. Other administrations chose not to invoke the kind of provisions that led to things like that. Trump administration had no problem with it. Now, what the Biden administration did when it first took office were a number of things, essentially vitiating or canceling out some of these really bad things that the Trump administration had done. One of which was, we're canceling these Remain in Mexico program, the migrant protection protocols. We're going to let people come in and make their claims here rather than saying, go wait outside somewhere and we'll call you, okay? But then there's a judge in Texas that essentially ruled in favor of the enforcement Trump administration types. So no, you can't do that. You're not allowed to essentially cancel this program. Now, I think that's been enjoined too, and it's all up in the air, and this is all going to get worked out through the courts. But that's what's also very troubling going forward, and that might be the biggest Trump legacy of all, Trump/McConnell legacy of all, the way that they packed the court with a number of like-minded individuals so that they will entertain these kinds of lawsuits designed to kind of perpetuate all of these really bad and repressive measures that were brought up under Trump. So to me, that's actually very troubling. I've talked too much. Somebody else.
Thank you both. Can
I just add something, Daniela? So what everyone has said is completely correct. 1965 was a turning point in immigration law. And actually 1968 is when we adopted the Refugee, Act, and really got asylum and refugee law going. And I think all of this was part of the momentum of the ethos in the country at that time. But also in 1965 and around that time of the civil rights movement, while the country was making a lot of moves, individual communities were not necessarily as open-minded, right? There was a lot of fear of Black movement from south to north and infiltrating the communities. And because of that, there was an increase in policing, an increase in incarceration, and the immigration movement kind of took on that momentum as well. And currently, we're facing kind of a similar situation, right? Heightened criminalization of immigrants and immigration violations, while we're also having some amount of increased policing. And so this is another part of the legacy of our sort of racist history that's brought into current immigration law, and that unfortunately, after all these years, one would think there would be improvement, but there isn't. And it's just kind of the same story over and over again, which to me is depressing. And hopefully someone else has a more hopeful message.
Thank you, Professor Aronson. So I'm going to wrap up the moderated questions, asking Dr. Agwal, and then I'll allow one other panelist if you want to respond as well after. Do you believe that the immigration system can exist independent of white supremacy? And if so, what are actionable things that the community can be doing to make a more equitable system?
Well, to be honest, that's a difficult question to answer. It depends on the year and the politics and the values that's happening and being espoused, depending on which administration we're working with. Personally, I would say that that's going to be a very difficult thing to do, to separate the two. And with that acknowledgement, we have to understand the history, right? And because we understand the history and even the legacy of that history, what I think we have to do now is find where are the gaps and how can we fill those gaps, whether it's ground roots organizing in local communities, or whether it's a regional Midwest thing, or joining in some kind of national movement. And I think that with all those layers, we have to take up personal responsibility, whether it means being more intentional about actually getting to know our neighbors who come from a different country, or allowing our children to be able to play together and meeting new people, whether it means saying, okay, you know what, we have an immigrant population here. How can we welcome them into our grocery stores? Maybe now I'm seeing now, for example, more grocery stores have an actual some of the products that I'm used to, or at least maybe one or two items. I've lived in Champaign-Urbana for a long time. I won't say how long, but long enough to know that this is within the last 5-7 years, the first time that we've actually seen a fully functioning African grocery stores in Champaign-Urbana. And with that being said, that's at least 20 plus years of not seeing that. So imagine, even just culturally, some of the ways in which that we can, quote unquote, combat, if you want to say, racism and discrimination. For me, it's about intentional acts, personally and also collectively in our own communities. I won't say that we will ever divorce racism and discrimination, because I think we've all witnessed that even if the laws are on the books, there's going to be someone that's going to take up that ideology and take up that value and think that they may be better than, or one group is better than. And we can only do our best to be able to eradicate some of those ideologies. And that's going to take a long time. So I'll leave that there and let others to continue that.
I would just say, following up with my previous pessimistic opinion, that I'm pretty pessimistic on this front. I think that our immigration system is so inherently based in racism that in order for us to divorce it, as Susan said, it would involve a complete starting from scratch type of a thing. It would have to be from the foundational level. We can't even get one immigration law passed in Congress. So like, are we going to be able to completely revamp the system? It feels unlikely. But one thing I would say that we can do locally is, it sounds very dramatic, right? But the Abolish ICE movement is really just a movement saying we need to get rid of this enforcement mechanism that is racially motivated. And so listening to people in that movement, perhaps co-signing onto it to some degree, it is a way to get involved. And we happen to live in a pretty activist state as far as immigration goes. We have a state that has laws that forbid local law enforcement from joining in with ICE. We have a lot of things for immigrants that other states don't have. Just the ability to get a driver's license if you don't have status here is huge. It makes a difference in the immigrant's life. So supporting state legislation that can actually help improve the lives of our immigrant residents is something else that we can all do. And telling all the other states to get on board, I would say.
Thank you both for your input on that question, and hopefully, although it is hard to see a hopeful future, that the work that you all are doing will make that a little more possible. So we are going to move on to audience questions at this point. I ask that we have one of two panelists answer each question, unless there's someone who really has something very important they'd like to add. So I will start with the first question, which asks, which communities are left out of current advocacy movements?
I'm going to jump in here and continue to uplift the voices of African immigrants. And I'm just going to say it plainly, we are often left out of the conversation, just as simple as that. I know that for the last quite a few years, there's been a push to really protect those who are undocumented. And the focus is always those who are coming from Mexico or South America as a whole. But what we also know that there are over 600,000 plus undocumented Africans who are here in the US. And that number continues to climb. And so whether it's talking about legal status, whether it's talking about overhauling or reforming the immigration system, we really have to start acknowledging the breadth and the width, I guess, the range of immigrants who are coming to this nation and who have also been here and have really paved the way for where we are now. So for me, and for a lot of the contexts in which I work in, I can honestly continue to say that African immigrants, even though, and I know in our community here, there's been a little bit more of a stronger push to include, and I so appreciate that. Working with Dr. Aronson and many others who are there and here in the community, that we still have a lot of work to do in terms of the national spectrum. And as Judge said before, thinking about the Muslim ban impacted mostly countries from Africa. So I'll let you all just kind of sit with that, because again, thinking about who is really impacted the most when it comes to who's being impacted along with others when we talk about creating policies or creating better laws and reforming the system. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Agwal. Okay. I will move on to the next question. Champaign-Urbana has a large immigrant community. What challenges come from having a major population that isn't given full legal rights for representation? How can we overcome this and respond?
I mean, this kind of feeds into what I was just mentioning with the things that we can do locally and at the state level to assist with making our immigrant population more integrated and more successful in our community. And so I would just, Illinois just passed a bunch of laws relating to this. So I would really encourage people to read about those laws, but then also to tune in to other immigrant advocacy groups and in other states. What are they doing to help the immigrants in their states, to try to understand the things that we could enact locally that would improve the integration of that population and the safety of that population.
I'll second what Professor Aronson has been saying about Illinois. Illinois is actually one of the more progressive states when it comes to passing specific legislation that will at least, if not greatly benefit, at least prevent exploitation, discrimination against the immigrant population, whether it's the Trust Act, whether it's recently, I know that I think the governor signed something dealing with detention centers that essentially defunded detention centers that are being housed starting next year that would house immigrants as well. I agree, the local approach in the absence of any action by Congress, which hasn't acted in years, although I will say there is a bill before the House. If any of you are close to your congressional representatives, there is a bill that's gone through the House. It's actually probably about the most propitious time to do this, because I'm afraid what's going to happen in less than 2 years, let alone less than 4 years, get behind those. But again, I agree, as a state, what Illinois has done for immigrants is very much worthy of your support.
Thank you so much. We will move on to the last question. I'll direct this to Professor Leroy since he has already touched briefly on it, and then open it up after if anyone else would like to answer. But the question is, how can we begin to rectify the results of forced migration, specifically for Native American peoples?
Well, thanks for the easy question. That's really a tricky question. It's tricky because the whole foundation of our country is premised on a false notion of liberty and equality for all, when you look at this from the Native American perspective. And, we can't go back and we can't turn back the clock to 1776. So to move the ball forward a little bit from that, the way that we have resolved this tremendous contradiction is we resettled Native peoples on their own lands and granted them sovereignty. And that creates the hard part for me to answer your question. I mean, how do we have full inclusion at this time in 2021 without eroding sovereignty, which is prized on Native lands and by Native people? So I am putting up a big question mark rather than a solution, but I am highlighting this contradiction. We're living with it as we live with the contradiction of slavery, and then the 13th Amendment, which ended that practice, the 14th Amendment, which created citizenship for Africans and their descendants, and we still haven't resolved that issue either. So I apologize. I won't sugarcoat it. I haven't answered the question.
No, I thank you for your transparency. I guess we lost Professor Aronson. I thank you for your transparency. It's not, we don't expect anyone in the room or in the panel to have all the answers, but only to be making an effort to get to that point. So this concludes the questions for today, as it is now 3 minutes past the time we're supposed to end. But I appreciate all of the time you have spent throughout your lives pursuing justice and looking at the immigration system in this way, and for taking the time to enlighten all of us here in this room and online to all of the things that we can be doing, can be learning more about in order to find a more equitable US. Thank you.